Hello, hello. How are you all doing? Can you please, before we do anything, help us out by just saying hello in the chat for us so that we know that you're all here, that you can, and most importantly, that you can hear us. So give us a wave, give us a hi in the chat. Hiya, David. Hiya, Jill. Hiya, Mark. Hi, Fran. How are you doing? Hi, Alex, Cheryl, Alexandra from Sheffield. It's the sun shining in Sheffield. It's glorious outside today. Jared, Gemma, Janet, Rachel. Awesome. So you can all hear me. Brilliant. And Martin.
Howdy.
I'm glad you can hear. So welcome to, I think this is our first webinar for West Yorkshire CIPD, certainly since lockdown happened. So I hope you're all well, hope everybody's well at your end and that you're all staying safe. That's probably the first and most important thing that I'm going to say this afternoon, only just. I have got the great pleasure of introducing Martin Johnson from MyBigPic. He's going to be taking the reins in just a second. You're in very good hands. And I'm going to slide away into the background. I'm still going to be around in the chat. And I am here if you've got any questions, and I'll pop in at the end. What I will say is that this promises to be a really interactive session. I'm so looking forward to it. I've got my pen and paper ready, so I'm hoping that you have too. If you've got any distractions, I know it's hard to say that right now because so many of us have got more distractions than ever before. Where you might have kids that you're homeschooling. I've got the same. I have a little girl in the next room who's doing her maths homework at the minute. So I appreciate that we're probably juggling an awful lot. So turn off as many distractions as you can, as is feasibly possible. You've got Martin for about the next hour or so, and he's going to be available for questions at the end as well, which is going to be amazing. So I suggest that you really take advantage of picking his amazing brain whilst we've got him. Right. The only other thing that I'm going to say is make use of the chat. It's going to be an interactive session, but please do make use of the chat, and that it just makes it so much easier and better for us as presenters. So do get stuck in. Right, I will leave you to it, Martin. I'll hand the reins over to you, and have fun.
Thank you very much, Barbara, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm in Leeds, Yorkshire, in the UK. I'm not familiar with who you all are and where you are, but hopefully through the hour, I'll get to know maybe a bit more. And as Barbara said, really keen for you to post comments in the chat. I won't be looking at it all the time because I really want to focus on what I'm going to go through. But from time to time, I might have a quick glance, and Barbara will as well. She'll be tracking that. And at various points, I'll be asking you to do things. I call it making and doing, and it's very much at the center of what I like to do. So a bit about me is an introduction, and I've just shared my screen. What I'm going to share with you today is what I've been developing as the first law of engagement. It is going to be the topic of a book that I'm bringing out, and this is really the first time I've taken it outside, if you like, of my circle of trusted people. So it's new material, totally original as far as I know, and if it isn't, please tell me. It's actually a key thing for me because I love anything to do with engagement, and about 10 or 15 years ago, I'm a business analyst by trade, and that's my day job. And what I found myself doing quite a lot, or being asked to do, is to go off and work with teams. And there was a particular guy I worked for, and he used to say, go off and talk to that team and find out what they do. And he used to say, do that thing that you do, and when you come back to the board next week or the senior management team, describe it in that way that you do, that everyone just gets. And actually the team give really good feedback as to how you do that. So he used to say, I don't exactly know how you do that, but just go off and do that thing. And so I kind of thought about that a little bit. And at the time, I was reading certain books around how to productize your business and how to develop yourself, I suppose, from a professional development perspective. So as you build up your knowledge and experience, how do you then capture that in the kind of essence of that in a form that you can have more fun with and spend more of your time doing the thing that you like? And I think there's a little lesson in there as well about how we develop as people and how we move it forward. It just so happened that it was engagement for me, and that's going to be the topic of today. My usual kind of delivery, and I'm going to share some slides as I move around, is that's me with a group of people a week or two ago. What I normally do is run sessions around the product that I developed called Big Picture. And you can see me there running a workshop. If at any point you want to kind of find me on LinkedIn or message me outside of this forum, if you just type in @YourBigPic, that'll kind of find me. And that was the product side. But what I realized in developing the product, that I was picking up quite a lot of evidence and material around engagement. And about a year ago, I went to a session, and there's a guy you can look up on YouTube, and I think he's very apt at the moment. His name is Simon Anholt. His surname is spelled Anholt. And he was talking about globalization. This guy is he's an advisor, a consultant to major governments around the world. And I listened to him for an hour in Leeds. He spoke without notes, by the way. He was one of these speakers that you just can't help be engaged with because of his content. And I think there's a lesson in there. I think we all know what engagement feels and sounds like when we've been part of a conversation. And it's that I'm very much trying to capture with this first law. But anyway, this Simon guy did something that I found very interesting, which was he took a concept of countries being better at what they do, and he acknowledged that some problems like we have now are global problems and they require collaboration, and that kind of perked my interest as well as him being an engaging individual. And when I listened to him, he also did something that I thought was very clever. He took something that was quite subjective and a judgment, which is what's good country and what isn't, and he developed a good country index. And what immediately happened is by formalizing, that's the right word, putting into a formula what he was passionate about, what it allowed people to do is to access it in a different way. And I thought that was really clever. So immediately countries could log on to his site and they could find out for themselves how they were doing. And of course, he could bring his learning into the formula, and therefore people could access it. So it was a very clever way of funneling his knowledge. And I walked away from that, and as well as developing the Big Picture product and having that as a big business development piece, what I found myself doing is challenging me to say, well, if I think about engagement in a particular way, then how could I encapsulate that into a law of engagement? If I feel passionate about it and I'm really into it, why shouldn't I be able to do that? So when I used to go and see these teams that I described earlier, and one of them would say to me, actually, I can see what you've done there. I can see what you've played back, but actually, can I show you how it might be a bit different? And I was like, yeah, of course, absolutely. It's that kind of engagement that I really like, down to the person level. So not top down kind of command and control, but actually bottom up. So we're going to move into some slides. That's what I'm going to go through today. So say if you want to look me up, I'm at YourBigPic. We're going to share with you some material today. I'm just going to move the slide on. I just wanted to show you this because I've actually had hair, and I got rid of the hair because of this, that, and the other, because I can't go to the hairdressers. So this was just me saying I had hair, and now I don't have hair. So if you meet me in the next few weeks or months or whenever, I may or may not have hair. So I'm going to move on. You will need for this practical walkthrough a piece of paper. So I would like you to get, if you're at desk or somewhere, just please grab a piece of paper. So I've got my kind of A4 here. A4 is absolutely fine. And I'd just like to start off with something, a little exercise, because we talk about engagement all of the time. And if you saw my message on LinkedIn this morning, I was referring to the fact that a lot of reports and narratives around engagement, I think it's ironic. In fact, sometimes I get quite frustrated with them because they come at it top down and they include vague percentages or narratives that I actually can't get hold of. So if I was reading this and thinking, yes, I have a problem in my business, what can I do about it? Reading that 55% of companies have low levels of engagement or whatever it is, that percentage immediately turns me off. So I find it ironic and frustrating that the very subject that we're trying to be better at is actually broached in the form of generic percentages and narratives that I can't get hold of and do something with. And that's what I want to do something about with your help. Now, I want to demonstrate how lousy we are at something. So I want you to look down at your piece of paper. Now, don't start doing this, but I want you to imagine something. I want you to imagine, and then I want to post the answer that you've got into the chat room. I want you to imagine if you could fold that paper 50 times, that's 50 times. And by the way, I know physically that you can't fold it 50 times. If you could fold it 50 times, could you estimate to me in any form you wish in the chat room how large or how high you think that stack of paper would be when you folded it 50 times? So you can either use a number, you can use a description or something, a metaphor, and I'd just like you to post that in the chat room. So 50 times, how tall would that paper stack be? And I'll go on when I've got 3 answers. Thanks, Mark. So I have an Empire State Building, I have 1 million somethings, and I have 0.5 centimeters. So not very. The point here is, and please keep your answers coming in, I love this exercise because it demonstrates something, and it's not meant to make you any more right or any wrong. It's not meant to make any of us look or sound clever, but what it does demonstrate is the fact that we're pretty lousy at certain things. So the metaphor here is, if we say that we are good at something like engagement, how do we know if we're not looking at the empirical evidence, if we're not looking at the maths or the formula behind it? And there will be elements of subjectivity in what I'm going to cover, but I think agreeing a kind of formula and a way of looking at it helps. Now, the answer, by the way, for those maths, and I can see somebody, I think it's Alex, come in, 2 to the power of 50, exactly, that's the maths. So the maths is here, it's called a geometric progression. And the reason I've got a sunshine on screen is because this was at the start of Malcolm Gladwell's book, and I can't remember which one it was, it could have been Blink. And what it is if you take 2 to the power of 50, you come up with a number, and if you take a general thickness of paper, you'll actually have a stack of paper that reaches more or less to the sun. So we're looking at about 93 million miles. Now, again, not meant to make anyone look foolish here, though you have put your answers in the chat, which is brilliant. So, of course, we can score that. I would come back and say, hang on, how can we get that so wrong? And what does that mean to our powers of estimation and our ability to estimate things? So if we think we're good at engagement and that's what we're doing, is that just our brain bias telling us that we're good at something? So it's a bit of a confirmation bias. There's another bias at play here. If I'd said to you how many centimeters, or when I did my hands like this, how much are you being led by something which is called an anchor bias? When actually, if I'd said how many million miles was it, immediately you would have thought. So the idea is here, if we're getting that wrong, what else are we getting wrong? What I would like you to do with your paper is to fold it 3 times, please, on the longest side. So in the most natural way you might fold the paper 3 times. We're going to use that for you to take notes as we go through. Now, I said on the long side, if you folded it along the short side, you'll end up with a piece of paper that looks like that. That's not good. You can try and make notes using that. It'll probably be more difficult, and I'd love to see what you come up with. Actually, something like this is really good. So we've got a piece of paper there, and what I'm going to use as we go through the presentation is I'm going to use those 8 boxes to work through what I've come up with as the first law of engagement. The whole idea of this is that by us understanding the law, you'll get the most out of it if you think about the different elements of it. You then think about it in the context of the work that you do. And if you're ever in a situation where you're talking about people first, values based, and particularly if you're in an organization where you are saying that you're willing to act upon what your employees and what your staff think, then actually applying the law in the way I've constructed it will at least lead to a really good conversation. Again, it doesn't have to be right or wrong, but it's better than trying to estimate the stack of a 50-fold piece of paper to an average of a foot or 2 foot when the actual answer is actually 93 million miles. Now, I'm very aware of the audience in the CIPD, and therefore I went, and when I had the initial conversation with Jonathan Broadhurst and initially with Barbara, if we go to box 1 of your paper in the top left, just make some notes around the why, and please personalize them and make them individual for you. Now, what I mean is, if you're familiar with the CIPD behaviours, which I think were republished last year, this is the wheel that I'm familiar with. And what I would like you to think about is, I mean, I've made this judgment already. There are 2 values on that wheel that I think that are more appropriate to engagement at the core. And I don't know if you just want to have a think and post in the chat. I'll keep going anyway, but I'd like you to just to reflect as to which those 2 are. And whilst you're doing that, I made some notes myself just beneath the wheel, which was to say, what drives me? Why am I doing this? And why should I care that I should share this with you? Is because, back to the point, engagement can be a vague narrative with percentages, but actually, where are the, what are the outcomes we want to achieve, and where's the evidence? Really important, where's the evidence? Now, I noted these down before I actually got into the wheels, so I'm just going to refer to, so the first one, valuing people. So when I was looking at the valuing people behavior this morning, it's all about creating shared purpose. It's about enabling people development and giving the employee a voice. And I don't know if you've heard of that concept about the employee voice. It's a big thing, I think, for CIPD. That's what they call it. I've read a lot about it. I think it's brilliant that the work they're doing to describe what the employee voice is, and that's giving every individual, bottom up, the chance to express their opinion. And I think often we lose that opportunity because it becomes too difficult and we haven't got that framework to work to. And so what it becomes is an engagement survey, which is very much top down, question and answer online. And all of these things I kind of balk at a little bit because I don't think they're actually great for the individual. So in terms of valuing people, it's about, I look down into what each level of the CIPD membership should do, about demonstrating empathy. It's about that comment. I remember way back when it said, if you tell somebody something, it's not necessarily true, but if they say it, then it's true. And so it's about listening. And the last part of valuing people, it mentions about well-being. And as part of the book I've put together, it actually ends with that as an epilogue, which is, if nothing else we're doing, we should be focusing on the well-being of our employees. And that is, it's broken down actually quite nicely in the concept called the 5 Ways of Well-being, which was put together by the New Economics Foundation, I think last decade. And I think it stood the test of time by a lot of people kind of using it and sharing it on top of that. And that's about connecting, being active, keeping learning, giving and taking notice. And I think they're all really good examples of things that we should be doing now. If I jump on to the next value that I think is important, working inclusively. So that's about collaborating. It's about going across boundaries effectively and inclusively to achieve, and guess what? Positive outcomes. So that outcomes word appears again. So there's this real appetite to go from engagement into actual outcomes. So we're 20 past 12. I just pause there a little bit. Anybody who wants to park something in the chat, that's great, about whether you're familiar with those values or whether you think there's any others that you think are relevant that will help me continue my learning with regard to CIPD and their take on it. I think all the work I do is original, but I like to hook into your NLP work, your CIPD frameworks, etc. So anybody that comes to me with those connections, then that's great. We'll move on in our work here. What would we like to happen as a result of this event? This is something from me. What I'd love you to do as a result of this event is, firstly, it stops you in your tracks. I love the word kind of the thunk. The thunk is like think, but it's a think that makes you stop and reflect. I like to think that I'm putting something in front of you which is like a thunk, which it makes you stop and think about something differently. I'd love it if you took this content and kind of shared it with colleagues, and I'd love you to help me kind of apply it, improve it, learn from it, and we'll get into how I'd like you to do that. Storytelling is fantastic. This is just a prop to tell stories around, and you'll see in the way I've broken the first law of engagement down, there are 3 essential components to it that we can actually work with. So given how much we talk about engagement, let's look at one way to nail it down into a formula that will help you. Now, I'm going to move on the slide, and I don't want you to freak out and think, wow, what the hell is that? I am going to show you a formula, and there's a lovely phrase which says, it's as simple as it can be without being any simpler. And the work that I've done, certainly with Big Picture, and in this case, the first law of engagement, I do believe it's as simple as it can be without being any simpler. And I'm going to show you it now. So, unleashing for the first time to the wider audience the first law of engagement. And what we're going to do is to use the folded paper to go through the breakdown of these terms. So you'll see it's got a bit in brackets at the front. Well, to the left, it's got E, which is the engagement coefficient, and that's what the first law is about. It's coming up with an engagement coefficient. This is an actual number which will describe how engaged you and your team were, or your colleagues, in a conversation that you have just had. And at this point, I would like you to think about a conversation or a meeting, probably before the hiatus hit, when it was back in the day and you were actually in an office and you were able to get together with teammates. You could indeed use an online session. You could even use this one, but I think there's too many variables in that. If you could think about specifically a meeting, a conversation that you had, whether it be a workshop, a meeting, a regular meeting, a one-off, an away day, whatever it was, what we're going to do is to work through the formula so I can help you calculate your engagement coefficient for that specific conversation. You'll see up in the top right, there are some strange symbols. My daughter pointed out that it looked like I'd created a new Greek alphabet symbol, as if that was meant to be a negative, but I actually thought that was the coolest idea. So I've got a smiley face meaning one thing, and then another face beneath it, and you'll see that appearing again with a bit of a constant in between. Now, I realize people's knowledge of maths will differ entirely, and this is the crazy thing. How are we going from a people issue, which is around engagement, and putting it into a formula? And we're going to look at that now. Just before we move on, please do think about a meeting that you are having, and you can see there, I've just put it on the notes. So I'm using box 2. If you're moving along the top of your page that's folded, to think of a meeting or conversation And if you would, to follow my lead, if you were to write in what that meeting or conversation was called, you might need to describe it in the form of the meeting title, or if it's a particularly good experience or bad experience, that really helps, because when you're approaching something from an evidence perspective, sometimes to have those kind of outliers, both bad or good, are actually quite interesting. So when we get onto the way we can record this, now, by the way, I don't expect you to calculate that formula. What I will do is provide you with a place to go to punch your numbers in and to come up with the engagement coefficient for that particular meeting. So hopefully, just give me, it's terrible for me to just keep talking without any interaction. If you could just post in chat maybe what meeting or group workshop were you thinking about? What would you describe it as? And maybe indicate whether you thought it was a good one or a bad one in terms of engagement. Excellent. So we've got a change management meeting, various stakeholder meetings. Okay. Credibility meeting, engaging with new clients. And yeah, we've got a few coming. That's excellent. Strategy meeting, excellent. So Gemma's good engagement because she's the host, which is brilliant. So we've got a range there, and I prefer you to use your examples than mine, because when we run the numbers, we'll learn more from that. I think my 3 examples were a one-to-one coaching session where the times, the number of people is quite small. The other one was a kind of regular team meeting, which I think we've got in the list of examples that Gemma shared. And I think thirdly, I broaden it out, the law of engagement. Should it work for a team? If you imagine a senior leader come into the office to give some news, good or bad, where you're all crowded into kind of a big room, I think hopefully we've all kind of been in a situation where there's news to be given. I think I called it a news story kind of environment. So I want the formula to work for all of that. I love the kind of sales update daily boss. That sounds like a good example to use to run the numbers, Gerard, for that, because it will give me a good sense of what the score comes out. The idea being, if we all calculate our engagement coefficient for these different examples, for the car crash university planning meeting, you see, this is what I like, because a formula looks really dry. But what comes alive is when you start interpreting it. And if I've got the formula right, then what will happen? A beautiful thing will happen, because what we'll see is we will gather evidence and we will gather the empirical data to back up why people are using words like car crash and daily bore. And if we can do that, then by using the formula and focusing on certain areas, we can then improve. And even if it's by 0.1, 0.5 or 2%, that makes a massive difference and a ripple effect for those around us, both in work and outside as well. So thanks for sharing that. That's excellent basis. So I'm going to go through now, and using your notes, I'm going to work through the formula as it is. So we start here. So what's this bit about? This is the first bit. So you've got a bit here that's about 1 plus BTM over AM. Wow, that sounds very geeky, doesn't it? But think about this. So a BTM is defined as a business thinking minute, and a minute's an easy one because it's the minute on the clock. So this is a time-based thing. This bit of the formula is about use of time. So a BTM is a minute spent sharing what I call a useful truth. And if you share a useful truth for the most of that minute, then you get to count up how many of those minutes you've spent. You may think back to your meeting, you may think about what we're doing on this call, We're sharing, I hope, useful truths. So let's break down those words really carefully. Sharing means I'm not keeping it to myself. And because you've put something in the chat, or you may be sat with someone and talking out loud, by externalizing the thought, you are sharing. And you may be sharing online, you may be sharing with your colleague, you could be sharing in the room. So sharing means you have to somehow externalize the thought. Useful reminds me a little bit of the SMART mnemonic. So specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, time bound. It doesn't have to be all of those things, but useful is about the thing that you're sharing has to be able to be turned into something positive. And I use my words really carefully though there, although I'm not using my notes, this is what I've written and defined in the book. Useful is something that can be turned into something good, a positive force. And remember earlier we talked about outcomes, as did the CIPD behaviors. So useful by definition means something you can turn it into something good, a positive force, something for the greater good. And a truth. Now, a truth is an easy one with a little twist. What I mean by a truth is that you believe it to be true, and that doesn't mean it's necessarily correct or factually right, but I think everybody has to have the chance to express a truth. And that means something that they believe to be true. Now, it may subsequently become not true, but at the time they shared it as a useful thing, truth, it was true to them. So back to your example, I would like you to think about how many minutes in that meeting, whether it be you facilitating it yourself, and obviously you might have a particular bias, and it's really interesting as to how other people would score that same meeting. But for now, I'm just asking for your point of perspective. So for now, maybe just record in whatever form makes sense to you, how many minutes of those available minutes were you sharing useful truths? So let's say if you were in the meeting for an hour and it was a bit lousy, maybe your business thinking minutes might be 5 or 10. If it was a fantastic meeting and you thought you were sharing useful truths for the majority of the time, then you may score yourself 30, 40, 50. And this is where there is some subjectivity to what we're doing. So it is a bit of fun, but I think there's a serious side to it as well. Thanks for sharing, Alexandra. On the bottom of that equation, you've got available minutes. That's a really straightforward one. That is how many available minutes there were. So I mentioned 60 if it's an hour-long meeting. You've then got 1 plus your BTMs, which could be 10 minutes, over your available minutes, which is your 60 or whatever it is. These figures we're going to use, there aren't a load of figures. There are only 4 figures that we're going to use to calculate the engagement coefficient. How they are put together and the complexity of that is something that I've worked away at, but I'm going to give you a tool to punch these numbers into, and you'll calculate the engagement coefficient. So you don't need to go finding your scientific calculator to do this. We've got a way to do this. So hopefully you're with me so far, and I can see I'm not looking in detail in the chat, but I can see things coming in. So it's really good that you're thinking this through, and I can see some feedback there. If at any point anyone's got a point to make that they're happy to have their mic turned on and chat it through, so you don't need to listen to me and my Middlesbrough accent droning on for an hour, I'm sure Barbara can do something in the background to do that, because I realise me talking at you for an hour isn't the most engaging thing in itself. So if you do want to make a point and you're happy for your mic to be turned on, as we're about halfway through, I'm sure if you send something to Barbara and I'll just give way and listen and go along with that. So this in box 4, or the top right of your sheet, this is where things start to get quite interesting. And what I'd like you to think about is the group size. So in the first part, we were talking about content, actually what information has been shared. What we're looking at here is the makeup of the group. Okay, so the smiley face with the lovely wavy hair, that's how many people you would say in that group were engaged in that meeting. So when you came out of the room and maybe you were walking back to your desk, and you may be walking back with a trusted kind of colleague that you can always have a little chat with, how many of those, if you were to say to them, blimey, that was a great meeting, everybody was engaged, you may feel therefore 8 or 9 of those 10 people were engaged, maybe 10. If you came out of that meeting shaking your head thinking just no one was engaged on that call, we had people on the line, people were talking, but actually nobody was really engaged in the conversation, then your smiley face number might be 2 or 3. So that's what we're looking at. How many people would you say were engaged in that chat? And then on the bottom of that fraction, and by the way, this is a kind of to the power of thing, which is where the maths gets quite difficult. And I'll explain why it is a power relationship in a second. On the bottom of that fraction, you've got another face, but it doesn't have any expression on it. That is just the total number of people in the group. So in the example I've given there, you had 10 people in the group. So that face with no face, if that makes sense, that's 10. So that fraction there would be 2 out of 10, 1/5. And the reason we're exploring this is because I believe that this is a significant part of the law of engagement, which is not only do you have to be sharing good content, what you have to be doing as well is you have to be looking at the group size. So the group size, who's engaged as part of the group, and how big is that group in total. And what I'm going to do when I explain these last couple of terms, what I'll do is I'll go to Barbara to see which example she might be using and how the terms are making sense for her in the form of like the 4 numbers. There are only 4 numbers here: the number of BTMs, the available minutes, how many were engaged in the group, and what the total size of the group was. So I'm coming to you, Barbara, in a sec. I'm just going to explain these last 2 terms. There, you'll notice in here every good formula, and I studied this, and I am being a little bit mischievous here. I studied formula and the way laws are constructed. People really liked a good constant in a law or formula, and they always beg the question for me is, where the hell did that constant come from? Why is it a constant? Why is pi that number? It just feels like it's really good to have a constant. And actually, what it allows me to do in terms of a fiddle factor is to influence the way the group size changes the engagement coefficient. Now, I believe we should set ourselves a massive target to engage with as many people as possible, which is why the group size is really significant and important. And what the fiddle factor there in the form of T, or in Greek terms, tau, T-A-U, which is very weird with my accent, tau does is it allows me to just set the dial on the way that group size affects things. And that's the end of the formula. No more maths. That is the end of the maths. That's the full equation. And at this point, I'm going to pause, and I have said there kind of the size matters thing. So on to Barbara, if you wouldn't mind, Barbara, at this point, just to give me a break and a little drink, a little reflect, maybe what example you're using and what your 4 numbers are.
What my 4 numbers are? Well, I was just looking at the number of people that we've got just using this on this challenge, because I think that's what you shouted out, isn't it, Martin?
Mm-hmm.
So we have 22 people on this challenge, on this webinar.
Yeah.
We have, I was looking at how many comments that we've got in the chat. We have 41 comments in the chat. Now, where I was getting stuck, and it's probably because my maths is a bit ropey compared to yours, because I think you're a lot faster than I am, was when I was looking at the chat, all I did was count up how many people actually commented. What would you have done? Would you look at how many people, individual people, were commenting and chatting?
Yeah, I think it's a thought in itself, which is do people actually commenting mean that they're engaged? I think it's an indication of that. And I think all I would say is afterwards, or at this point, we would kind of reflect back, and we would probably, in the summary, by going around the room, we may not do that on this call because it's an online environment, but the way I would kind of moderate that is that it'd be good to like do around the room to see how people have engaged at what level. So immediately, because you're using this webinar, I can tell already that hang on, this is, as I mentioned earlier, just a session that you can use. So you're actually using this webinar. That suggests to me that as kind of co-host, then that's something you've been listening along and doing. So I could count you as one of my engaged. Now, if we have 22, you could, I don't know if let's say 10 or 12 of them are engaged in chat. I would like to think it's higher because I'm biased and it's me and I love this topic and I want everyone to love it as much as I do. But I don't know if you had to put a number on that 22, how many people so far are kind of engaged with that topic, with this topic?
Well, this is all just me having a quick look through the chat. So we have 41 comments in the chat. So that's individual comments. However, there are some repeated names coming up. So obviously some people are more, and you can argue they're more engaged than others, or they're more happy to use the chat than others. Now, certainly when I've done webinars before, I know that people are quite happy to listen, take notes, and they don't need to actually engage in the chat, but that doesn't mean to say that they're not actually engaged on the topic.
Yep, indeed.
So I'd probably say about 10 individuals, just as a rough guess, literally finger in the air, different people commenting.
Fantastic. And we've been in here 41 minutes. Out of how many of those minutes have we been sharing useful truths?
41 minutes.
Oh, get in. That's the best. That's the point for my webinar. I think we'll just close it there. So you can see how this, just through that chat, it doesn't have to be right or wrong. It just has to form a conversation. What I've done by expressing the law as I have is I'm focusing in on what content are we sharing? Are they sharing useful truths? And if not, kind of why not? Now, I realize there has to be small talk. I love small talk. What happened at the weekend in the football when there used to be football? How's the garden? How are the kids? All that stuff's amazing, but I'm focusing this on business. So therefore, there may be something. I think my mic might have gone, Barbara.
Yeah, I think it might be at your end. Do you want to check it at your end? Because I can still hear. Oh, I can still.
Yeah, Alex can hear you. It might be Gillian. I'll continue
Gillian,
if three.
At your end.
Yeah, three. Can you hear me?
Can we just have a quick check in? Yeah, can everybody else? Yeah, Gillian, I think it's at your end.
Okay. So that, can we count Gillian as an extra engaged now because she's posted in the chat?
I'm just going to have a quick look and see. I think Gillian's already commented.
Ah, there we are. I love the fact you're so data focused. You didn't even allow me to get away with adding one.
Oh yeah, why not? But what I love about this,
I like that. That means we're data focused and evidence based. So I'm going to crack on because I'm aware of time. So thanks, Barbara, for that. That's interesting. And if everyone is doing something similar, we will have a place to kind of punch these numbers in a minute and calculate what that means. So Barbara's given us the lovely 41 out of 41, which is probably a little bit kind to me. 10 out of 22 is probably about right in terms of, well, what does engaged mean? It is online, so it makes it a bit more difficult. I think if I was in a room, stood over there, and I was handing out lovely symbols and I was asking people for their interaction, I would like to think I could knock that 10 up to 16, 18, 20. And that's very much how my mind's working when I'm working with a group. And maybe we all should be thinking a little bit about that, about is everyone getting the chance to express themselves? So now I'm going to time out a little bit, so I'm going to speed up. So we focused on the BTMs, so the shared useful truths, that's about the content. And then we talked about the group size. And I'm now going to think about going on to, well, whatever your engagement coefficient is, and you will get a number out of that. I'm not going to do it now because it'll take a bit of time to share. You have all now almost, well, you have calculated, you will be able to calculate your engagement coefficient. And by the way, that number comes out somewhere between 1 and about 4 or 5. An engagement coefficient of 4 or 5 is like incredible. There's something amazing happening in your numbers. An engagement coefficient between 1 and 2 is pretty good. Between 2 and 3 is good. And that's the kind of scale we're looking at on the evidence we've collected so far. And what I want to do is to gather more and more evidence and examples. So where you get to describe the meeting you've had, you give me the numbers, you get the engagement coefficient. And then what do we do with it? We talk about how we can improve it. So there's a poll knocking about, I think, Barbara. I don't know if you can, I know you're doing some stuff with Julian. If you can release the poll for me whilst I'm talking, if you can't, let me know, because I think I can do it, just whilst I describe what we've got here. So what I've done over the years and what I've realized is I've developed a series of engaging practices, which whatever your engagement coefficient is, and we're going away from the maths for a few minutes, which some of you will probably like, I've come up with some practices. So if you can see that on screen, my kind of page timed out a little bit, spaced out a little bit. So there are actually 12. And I'd like to focus, and if you notice in the poll, I've chosen 5 from those first 8 in the first 2 columns. And the reason for that is there is a second law of engagement around productivity, which I think those ones on the right-hand side are more relevant for. So we're going to leave them for another day. But what I've done is I've picked 5 from the left-hand side, and I'm asking you to just look at the title, maybe look at the image that you've got in front of you. And if you think that's something that you're interested in and it piques some interest with regard to how you could improve your engagement, I wonder if you can share that with me. And what I'll do is I'll go into a bit of detail as to what that is, and then we can then come back. So I'd just like you all to vote to give me some kind of sense as to which one is piquing your interest more than others. And hopefully the poll software will be working. Okay. So let's take a look at that. So we've got, let's start with, interestingly, positive feedback's coming in at 5, but it's not showing the flood bar for me. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus down on positive feedback, which is around somewhere, which is around here. Now, what I do is these are quite in-depth practices. So what I do in the book is I go into a bit of detail with this, but just in the time that we've got, I just want to give you a sense of what it's all about when we do positive feedback. So this is the kind of thing. You've got your engagement coefficient calculated, which you will have in a minute. These are practices which I want to share and describe as things you can actually practice, functionally practice, like hitting a golf ball. There's no point in me saying to you, go and give positive feedback, unless one of 2 things or both happen. One is that I share some thoughts about how that could happen, and there's a lot written on positive feedback. This is just my take on it. Again, all this work is original, but I do declare any references that I think are relevant. And secondly, you kind of practice it. So when we get onto the kind of takeaways, we'll see how practice is really important. So the build, measure, learn thing, or in this case, kind of calculate or try, calculate, learn. So positive feedback as an example, what I go into in the book is about an objective base. So I think it's fair, and some of you might know more about positive feedback than me, so this is a very personal experience perspective. Having an objective base is only fair and right. So when you're looking to give positive feedback, for me, you're looking for that kind of shared common perspective where it's a fair and level playing field. And I keep using the word fair because I think when in dialogue with another, it's almost you're like an equal. I never kind of see this hierarchy. I always see kind of professionals working together, using the best bits of what they've got. And using that objective base is a really good starting point. If I was going into a conversation about that, what I describe is, how do you seek out that kind of fair and level playing field? How do you ensure that when you provide that feedback, it's going to land in a place that your colleague or colleagues can do something useful with? And there are those words again. Timing your feedback. So there'll be a kind of cycle to this. And what I'm aware of in the work that I do, and we see this in agile methods, which is, it's quite important to discipline yourself to feedback in a certain way in a timeline, so it doesn't appear kind of out of context or an interruption to what you're doing. So I talk a bit about how to set up that framework. Positively specific. What I mean by that word is, it's being positive. There's a way to do that. So I was on a webinar recently that talked about the kind of sandwich approach to feedback, which is where you hide good news and bad news like together. And I know there's some science around that I'm going to go off and read more about, but making sure that the overall effect of that for your colleague is positive, and to then cycle regularly, because you may not get it right the first time that you do it. And so positive feedback is one of the practices that I think, once you've calculated your engagement coefficient, and I know I keep teasing you with this, but I am going to share the link in a minute where there's a tool to do that. My conversation with you, or my support, or my suggestion to you, is that by adopting these practices in a particular order will improve your engagement coefficient. It will do so because either you will share more useful truths, which means your BTM count goes up as a proportion of your available minutes, or you will engage with more people in the group, and ideally you'll do both those things at the same time, in which case your engagement coefficient goes up. I'm looking at the poll, and I'm going to do one more in the time because I know I'll time out, and we were going to cycle at this point anyway. It was just how many we got the chance to cycle around. Novelty factor, I've kind of chosen that one. No, I think the data backs it up, that it's a favorite of mine. Novelty factor being the fact that we take people, sometimes I always think about the hose pipe laying in the grass, or the water pouring down sand. The brain has a certain way of thinking about things, and I might not use the right words here because I'm not a trained psychologist, but I do observe that once you have those ways of thinking about something, they're actually quite difficult to break. And if you read about habits and rituals and things like that, which I like to read a lot of, it shows how the neuroplasticity of the brain means that sometimes you can get stuck in a bit of a rut. Novelty factor is all about breaking that cycle and actually doing something a little bit different. Now, in the book, I talk about different ways of doing that. So challenging established ways of thinking, reframing the problem, the novelty element. It could be as simple as something, having a bag of props or something that you could go and pull out, and you say to someone, you know, how does this old car horn, I just happen to have it on my desk, I won't park it just in case if some of you fall off your seats. How does that car horn relate to what it is you're doing? It's something novel and different. So what it is it about the car horn that you can pick up and take? It's a novelty factor. It's something different. It's very much something that lateral thinking and Edward de Bono talked about ages ago. And it's something I absolutely believe in. So that's a novelty factor one. I'd love to go into some of the other practices. All I would say is the natural follow-up to this session is the fact that, number one, we're able now to calculate our engagement coefficient. And just like Barbara and I had a bit of a dialogue around, is it this or is it that? We're just looking to have a conversation about the fundamental elements of engagement in the form of a formula, which, as far as I know, cannot be done in any other framework. If there is another framework, please let me know, because I think formalizing something like this is quite original and different and leads to really good conversations. Secondly, once you know that, you can use these practices which is my responsibility as a thought leader to describe in a way that you can practice and get out there. And moving into my kind of box 8, so if you're following along on the paper, you're down in the bottom right hand side now, is to do that thing that I said, which is to engage, measure and learn. So do the things that you were doing anyway, and when we get out of this, it probably sounds a long way off to be back in a room with people working away, or even online sessions, as Barbara related to earlier. My takeaway refers back to something I said earlier. By taking this formula and applying it in a certain way, you can actually improve your techniques of engagement. And just in the chat, I promised all the way through I would share something, and I'm just going to put it in the chat. I teased with this all the way through. Now you might want to take that, I think we can click on it and go outside the site. If you get any kind of security messages, it might be best just retyping in it. At yourbigpic.com, what I've put /CIPD, I've put a tool, and it calculates all the engagement coefficient for you. And to help me to help you, what I'd love you to do is to go there at your own leisure. You could do it now, or you could do it later in the day when the next session happens. What I would love you to do is to get into the practice to help me have a good dialogue with you, is to type in these figures. Barbara had the 41s, the 10s and the 22s. If Barbara went onto that page and typed them in, and most importantly, if you describe the type of meeting it was, as you did in this chat, that helps me enormously, because what it allows me to do is to compare different types of meetings. And if I've got it right, which I think I have, because I've tested it extensively, I've got now a way of capturing how you're delivering your content, what that means to sharing useful truths and to your count of business thinking minutes, how the people that you're with are engaging with what you're delivering, and how that focuses both content and the style of delivery through a formula that we can have a bit of fun with, just like Simon Anholt earlier is playing around with his good country index. What I would love to do is to build a community with your help to understand better the practical level engagement that we are involved with, and then all be responsible for doing something, whether it's using the practices that I describe or not, to improve that. And that's a good, wholesome use of time, particularly now where it feels really difficult that our precious time is maybe not being spent with the people that we want to, whether it's at work or at home, with relatives, etc. So there's a wider engagement point here. I'd like to think I've captured that in a formula, and I'm pretty much done. And the fact someone's managed to calculate it and it looks about right, Gemma, that's amazing. Barbara, just whilst I scour the questions, do you want to just do a little reflect and a sweep up, and then I'll pick out one of the questions for me?
Yep, I will pop back in. So, has anybody got any questions for Martin? This is a fantastic opportunity. So you've got him here. He's a sitting duck. You know, by all means, pick his brains whilst he's here. If you've got any questions, stick it in the chat. That's fine. Or if you want to jump on and talk directly to him, that'd be cool.
Yeah, I can pick that one from Janet, which is, how do you know how to improve? So there's two things there, Janet. One is by trying something out, measuring it, as you might have done by calculate. Firstly, calculate the engagement coefficient for something you've done. Then, if you want to be helped a little bit by our engagement practices, pick off one or two that you think would be relevant to you and enter into a dialogue, or just take them and try them out in your next session, and then recalculate your engagement coefficient. And by doing that, just like the lean startup talks about build, measure, learn, what you'll be doing is engaging, measure and learning. And the reason on the share there's a little circle, a cycle, is because the more we do that, the more practice we'll get, because we don't expect to get it right first time round. So the detail of the practices are there. They're currently in the book, and there'll be some way of me sharing them when the book is published, and also through blogging, etc., because it's in the practices where the transferable skills are. And I'd love to help you with that, because that's the work that I want to do in sharing useful truths. I'm almost evidence of the formula in itself. Any other questions?
What we'd also love to know, whilst you're thinking of your questions and typing them in, is what are you going to do differently as a result of this session? What are you going to do differently? Because it's great that, you know, learning from Martin, but what one thing are you going to do differently? So stick that in the chat too. We'd love to know what questions you've got, or what was your biggest point of learning from today. I'm sure that'd be helpful, wouldn't it, Martin?
Would love to. I'd love to hear another voice, Barbara, just to finish off.
Yeah, one more person, one question, and then we can go. That'd be great. Okay, we've got one from Gemma. How does the formula account for the participants' expectations? Can you see that one?
Oh, that's a good one. Challenge. That's a good, really good question. Account for the participants' expectations. I think only in respect of, from where it's like that question, if you go on a training course, I think, what did you know about this topic beforehand? And I think trainers and L&D people I work with do this quite a lot. They'll say, oh, well, how much did you know about beforehand? So you might know 2, you may give yourself a score 3 out of 10. And then at the end of the session, you can then ask again. And I guess in that respect, you're reflecting the kind of, you can look at the expectation of the participant. So it is a difficult question. I think.
Could I just jump in?
Yeah, go ahead, please.
It's a difficult one because it's how do you actually assess the participants' expectations in the first place? So I think it is about having a scoring system, but asking the question at the beginning of the session, what is it that you want from this session? And then seeing whether it actually aligns with what you want, what you're actually going to cover and what the session's all about. Yeah. So that kind of ascertains whether the material or the information beforehand was on point. What do you think, Martin?
Yeah. No, I think that's good. And I think if I have to stand very close to the law of engagement here to say, with those expectations or anything else that you come in with, funnel them through one of two things. One is use those expectations to create more business thinking minutes. So if the expectation is something about their level of contribution or their level of engagement, then create the environment and the situation for them themselves to contribute to business thinking minutes. So are they going to be given the opportunity to share useful truths? And that's a question for us, maybe as facilitators going into that. And then afterwards, based on those expectations, were those one of the people that you could say were engaged because of what you did, knowing those expectations? So I almost see it as a parameter getting passed into the law, that familiarization and knowledge of that expectation should put you in a better position for them to create more business thinking minutes. And secondly, be one of those people you could count upon to say they were engaged. So it's kind of a big feat. And the reason it's a complex and a really good question is because that could be proven to be a massive predicator for how you create business thinking minutes and engage people. And I think that would be one of the massive contributing factors to that. So that's an area of investigation as well. What needs to be in place, clear and good expectations. So I really like that angle, Gemma.
Brilliant. Fantastic. Well, I think we're pretty much just over an hour. So we'll leave it there if that's all right, Martin. If anybody has any more questions for Martin, then you've got, what's your email? Can they with email?
It's martin.johnson@yourbigpic. If you just type in @yourbigpic into pretty much anything, it'll come up. Yeah, it's kind of my tag. So just find me on that email or social media, LinkedIn, and I will be. If you do submit your scores on that page, then it gives me the chance to help you with the practices and also put them on the graph to see how the evidence is determining how we go forward. And I love to progress this with people as a joint learning and funnel everybody's particular specialism and knowledge, which I haven't had a chance to find out about today because of the format. It allows us to funnel that through the law as well to see how people's particular take on it lands and whether how good that conversation becomes, because I think it becomes a really good and focused conversation, and it's not top down generic percentages. It's actually what practically we're doing to make this a better place for us to work.
Fantastic, thank you. Whilst we're all on, I just want to remind you that we have another session, another webinar it's happening on the 27th of April. It's all about digital wellbeing and remote working, and it's at 12 o'clock, so it's midday on the 27th of April. And it's about how caring for digital habits can enhance wellbeing, focus and productivity. So this is a great one for you and your teams. And it's going to be run by Alex Levy. Now I'm going to put the link to, I think Martin, have you just put something in from Dropbox there? No.
Nope.
Let me just pop something in the chat. I think we were both typing at the same time. That's why it confused. So there's the link to register to that next week's webinar. And I just want to say a massive well done, Martin. I've thoroughly enjoyed today. I've learnt loads. We've got Rachel who said, I'm currently studying my L3 and this session has been informative. Thank you. David's going to be thinking about how to apply this to facilitate in action learning sets. Gemma, thank you for the session today, which will be able to support some work she's doing on colleague advocacy. So thank you so much for getting stuck into the chat and getting engaged, and I hope you all got something out of it, which I know you all will have done. So thank you so much, Martin, for your time.
No problem. Good to meet you all. Take care.